iCloud. And now I'm going to hit let all these people in, admit all. Oh, wow. So we're up to 72 people, 73, 74, 75, 76. Oh, we're going to have like, I'm going to hit all. How exciting. Okay, let's see. I'm letting people in right now. We have a lot of people entering. Let's see. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. In the chat, please share your name, where you are from, and your role.
Thanks for asking for that, Ronit. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
I will also do my best to monitor the chat, and we will have time at the end for a Q&A with Sue.
Thank you for the person from Australia who's here at 1 a.m.
Wow. Let's see, it looks like people are still coming in. I'm going to try to look at the chat. Let's see, Carson City, Nevada, Cincinnati, Ohio. Hello to all my friends that are joining us today. Wisconsin, Chico, California, yay, California. Boston. Oh, I see Adelaide, Australia, New York. Oh, this is so exciting, Sue. Santa Rosa, yay! New York, Virginia, Colorado. Okay.
Got Boston, we got Buffalo, where my dad's from.
Okay, everybody. My name is Ronit Glickman, and I serve on the International Dyslexia Association Northern California's board, and I will be your host this morning. We are so excited to offer you this free webinar. As a nonprofit organization, we are dedicated to helping individuals living with dyslexia. We provide essential evidence-based research, information, and resources. To increase public awareness, we host webinars, workshops, and teacher trainings. For more information about IDA, please visit our website at www.norcal.dyslexiaida.org. Also, please consider becoming a member of our IDA community. I will add a link in the chat in a little bit. First year's membership is free for all teachers. Today, we are so excited to welcome Sue Shabeta Heglin. Sue, I'm so thrilled that you're able to join us. This is so exciting. People don't know what they're in for a treat. Sue is an educator, author, and frequent speaker on topics related to spelling. She began her career doing research and instructional design, but her focus shifted in 2003 when she learned that one of her children is dyslexic. Trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach to literacy instruction, she has been studying and teaching about orthographic linguistics since 2014. Sue has served on the board of directors for the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association, on the board of education for Brandon Valley School District, and is currently the editor-in-chief for the International Dyslexia Association's fact sheet publications. She is the founder of the website learningaboutsspelling.com, and the author of the book, Beneath the Surface of Words, What English Spelling Reveals and Why It Matters. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sue Shabeta Haglin.
Thank you so much, Ronit, for that introduction and for the enthusiasm and the opportunity to be here. Toby, I'm going to ask you one thing. I don't know if you can do this, and it's not a big deal if you can't, but if you can allow people to share their screens, it's always nice to be able to see faces when I'm talking. I like to see when people are, it's resonating, or maybe they're looking a little puzzled, because then that tells me maybe I want to explain a little more. And if that's not possible, no big deal. But if you are able to allow people to share their screens, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I'm so glad to be here with everyone. I'm so glad to get a chance to talk to you about spelling, this topic that I find so fascinating, and that there is so much really that we can learn about that will allow us to help children, help students, and help us as educators, and also as advocates for the children who need our support in learning how to become fully literate. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the areas that we need to understand if we want to understand spelling more completely, things that will help us demystify spelling. And so we're going to start out by just talking a little bit about why spelling might seem mysterious to us. Because in many ways, we know that a lot of aspects of spelling make perfect sense, right? We know a lot of things about why words are spelled and how we can understand the spelling of words. But every now and then we run into these words where we're like, what's going on with this word? Why is this word spelled the way it is? And one of the reasons for that is our model for reading. And this model has components in it that are absolutely essential for students to become skilled readers and spellers. But what we'll talk about is that this isn't enough. So if our model is really just about this piece, then we're going to have spellings that won't make sense. So the first thing that we typically think about when we think about spelling is that when we're looking at a written word, and this little arrow is a reminder for me to tell you that when you see angle brackets in this talk or in any of my work, what that angle brackets is representing is a written form of a word. So here we're talking about the written form of the word cap, separated a little bit so you can think of those individual graphemes, and the written form of the word mesh, or the word that we would spell F-I-T. So this is about the written form. So what we do then with spelling is we take that written form and we look at each individual grapheme and we pronounce the phonemes. So for cap, we would pronounce app. And then here again is this is a reminder to say this is a representation of phonemes in between slash brackets like that. And then we blend. I was going to define them first. So I added this last night. So I want to define these for you before I forget. So a grapheme, I'm going to use that term, and a grapheme is a letter or combination of letters that we use to spell words. So the written word W-I-T-C-H has 3 graphemes, W-I-T-C-H. Sometimes they're more than one letter together, and you see some other examples there. A phoneme is the smallest meaningful segment of a spoken word. And you may be familiar with this terminology, but some people are not, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And typically when we look at spoken words, we're isolating those meaningful segments, and then we're showing kids how to spell them with graphemes, with letters or combinations of letters. So as we think about decoding words, then we're thinking about identifying the graphemes, pronouncing the phonemes, blending them together, right? This is an essential skill for reading. And it's all that we need for some words, right? We have a whole bunch of words, maybe half of the words in English. This is all you would have to know, and you could read the words, you could spell the words. We have words like shrimp and even fantastic, which is a polysyllabic word. But if you're familiar with Orton Gillingham, you know that this word is often used when we're starting to get kids to decode polysyllabic words because it works really well. Doesn't work as well with every single word that's more than one syllable. So based on this model, then words make sense if they can be decoded with no uncertainty just from the spelling and understanding the graphemes and the phonemes. But then we end up with these words that we would call irregular, or maybe we wouldn't call them irregular, but we would say there's a part of that word that's tricky. We know that there are pieces that we can help kids understand, we can understand ourselves, but then there are other parts where it's like, why is that particular grapheme in that word? Why is that pronounced in that particular way? So when spelling, we go the other direction. We think about the basic skill of encoding as isolating the phonemes, taking a pronunciation of a word, a spoken word, being able to isolate the phonemes that make up that spoken word, and then writing typically the most common grapheme that will represent that phoneme in English. Now, we know that often there's more than one option, so then that can become a bit of a memorization exercise. Which particular way to spell is in this word? But these skills are essential, right? Kids have to be able to do both of these things. But when we get to spelling, and especially when that's where we're starting, lots of words become even more difficult. So some words can be read with confidence, but then when we go to spell them, we're just not quite sure. Why does bisect have one S and dissect have two? Why does talk have an L? There are schwas in these words, those neutral pronunciations that make it hard to identify exactly what vowel is being used in the spelling from the pronunciation alone. And then we also have words where there's some sort of letter in there where, like, I don't know why that's there. And I totally understand all of this. This is where I was before I was exposed to this information that I'm sharing with you today. So the question then is, why do we need to go beneath that surface spelling? We know that we don't want to teach kids whole words. We want to teach them the pieces, the graphemes and the phonemes that make up that word. But even that is sort of the surface level. We want to go a little bit deeper and look at the structures that form words. Look at the signals that are encoded in those words besides signals of pronunciation, right? We know that there are signals of pronunciation encoded in words, but there are other signals that we may not be aware of that can help us understand spelling. And really what we want to be thinking about is, what is the ultimate purpose of spelling? Is it just to represent the pronunciation of a word, or is there more going on? And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I thought I would start today's discussion with a discussion of the word toward, because there was a recent conversation on Facebook. There are some wonderful discussion groups on Facebook for sharing information about the science of reading and structured literacy in ways that we can be really effective with students. But a lot of times those are the places where questions are posed. What's going on with this word? And someone asked, how would I analyze this word toward, spelled T-O-W-A-R-D, as a heart word? Now, this idea of a heart word is something you may be familiar with, but the idea is these blue dots are things that we can say make sense. But these are things that either kids have to learn by heart forever because they just we don't have an explanation for them, or sometimes that's used to say they have to learn it by heart until they reach that pattern or that spelling, that grapheme and that particular pronunciation that will be learned later. But to some extent or another, this word, a heart word, is defined as having parts that we have to learn by heart. It's funny because a friend of mine, I was showing her this slide and she said, whenever I see those hearts, I think those are the parts of the word I really love. So, you can interpret heart words in different ways. But anytime you're looking at an analysis like this, and the question that came up about this word, we're starting with, how do we understand this word by looking at its pronunciation, just the whole word's pronunciation. So what was really interesting is, how do we pronounce this word? And when I pronounce this word, if I say it in a sentence, I'm going toward the store, I pronounce it as though it rhymes with Ford. I'm going toward the store. Other people might pronounce it differently. And these were just some of the kind of contributions in this discussion. The third person pronounced it like I do. And then a bunch of other people said, it's not just in South Carolina, I pronounce that word that way too. Somebody said, well, I pronounce it like toward. The person from Minnesota it's like almost like toward. There's like a little doubling there in their analysis of it. And there was a question, is it one syllable or is it two syllables? People had different opinions on that. My favorite comment was, someone said, now that I've said it about 25 times in a row, I'm not sure how I say it, right? When we're trying to analyze these words, it can be really challenging. So this is why morphology matters. And Marcia Henry has been telling us this for decades. So let's take a look at this word and think about, before we try to analyze the relationship between the phonemes and the graphemes, let's start with its structure, its morphological structure. So this is the morphological structure of this word. It is a base element, TO, and it is a suffix, W-A-R-D. And we're going to talk about how I can tell you that as we go along. But here's our first point, that as we look at this, we want to think about the structures. I want to give you a couple more definitions. Morphology is the study of the meaningful structures that form words, morphemes. And those morphemes are the smallest meaningful unit of language, right? We can say that an SH is smaller than, say, the word, the base SHIP, but SHIP means something where SH doesn't really have a meaning by itself in the language. So we have morphemes in spoken language. I can say the word ship, and that's a base element, and we can write it, SHIP. So another way to define that is as the smallest linguistic unit with a meaning or a grammatical function. And this gives us a good idea of a morpheme, but we can even go a little deeper than that, which we're not going to do today, but there are even other things that morphemes do other than just giving us a meaning or giving us a grammatical function. So in this spelling then, in the word toward then, which we can speak and we can write, it has two morphemes. And this little hyphen here I'm using to indicate that we've got a suffix. If I place a hyphen before an element, it's an indication that it's a suffix. If I place a hyphen after, it's an indication that it's a prefix. You don't have to use that notation, but I just wanted you to be aware of it. So here we have three different words, and the first two have two morphemes, a base and a suffix in the first one, a base and a prefix in the second one, and a base with both a prefix and a suffix in the third. And then the other terminology to know is that when we talk about written morphemes, we can talk about them as an element. So when I talk about elements, you can use that in a more generic way, but I'm using that specifically to refer to a written form of a morpheme. All right, so we've got this word toward, spelled T-O-W-A-R-D, and I'm telling you that we can analyze that as a base and a suffix. And the question is, how do I know that? So let's talk a little bit about how we get there. The first question we want to ask is, do we see these structures elsewhere in the system? Because morphemes, written and spoken, are kind of building blocks for the language, and they show up almost always. They will show up in at least one or two other words, and often in many words. So do we see these structures elsewhere in the system? So let's start with the W-A-R. Well, actually, we'll start with the two. So the T-O comes into many other words where we can form complex words with more than one morpheme in them. So we have the word into, we have the word onto, we have the word today, and we can see these spelled T-O plus D-A-Y, into spelled I-N plus T-O. So we see that base T-O used in other places in the system with a similar sort of deep sense to it. And I'm not going to show you exactly how we get to all of that, but I'm going to show you how we do that well, I will show you something about that in a minute. But we can verify that both parts of these constructions are independent morphemes, and that these are valid hypotheses using morphological analysis and etymological research. So I'm going to show you one other tool as we get started that is very helpful as we begin talking and thinking about morphology. And that is what is called an orthographic morphological matrix. Again, you may have come across this type of a matrix before, but I want to just make sure you're clear on what is present in a matrix. There's a banner down the middle with a base element and then an orthographic denotation. The base element may be a free base that forms a word by itself, as in this case with this TO, or it might be a bound base, like a JECT in the word inject or reject or project. So it can be either free or bound, but there's a base element there and its orthographic denotation. The orthographic denotation is not the same thing as the definition of a word that's formed from it. What it is instead is this kind of deep sense that comes from its etymology. It comes from its history, and we can determine words that we can use to describe this orthographic denotation by looking at the meaning of historical roots. And we'll look at that in just a minute with the word toward. So this is the foundation of a matrix. Every matrix has a banner. And many matrices will have other things. Here we have a suffix that's been added to show that we can form the word spelled T-O-W-A-R-D. We can also add additional base elements. And in a matrix, if you see something that's in bold, that's typically a base element. That is how we can indicate that something is another base, where we're looking at a compound structure when we combine that with the central base. So here we have additional base elements on both the left and the right. We can form a number of different compounds with this base TO. If we had prefixes in this matrix, they would go on this left side, but they would not be bold. There are no prefixes in this matrix, but I just wanted to explain how that works to you. So then once we have a matrix, we can work with the orthographic morphological word sum. And orthographic, by the way, means that we're dealing in a matrix and we're dealing in word sums with the written forms of the word. We're dealing with the orthography. And anything inside one of these boxes will be a morpheme, a written morpheme. So we have synthetic word sums where we can show how words are synthesized by combining morphological elements. And you may be familiar with the 3 suffixing conventions, the E convention, the wide I convention, the doubling convention. Those can also be reflected in a synthetic word sum where we show how those conventions take place in English. I don't have any in this matrix, so we just combine these elements together to create these words. We could also look at analytic word sums where we could take a completed word and analyze it into the written morphemes that form that word, that come together to create that word. So you'll be seeing a lot of word sums as we work together this morning in this talk. So we asked about whether we could see the TO elsewhere in the system, and we have it in words like into and onto and today and tomorrow. Do we see a suffix WARD elsewhere in the system doing essentially the same sort of job as we have here? And if we think about the idea of these words, we have a suffix WARD, right? We talk about going eastward, westward, southward. I'm thinking about going toward. Is that the same sense? We have to kind of think about that. But we definitely have a suffix WARD in English, not only in terms of absolute direction, but we could talk about looking heavenward or heading homeward, where this WARD suffix is coming up over and over again. And notice how many words we can identify here that have this same suffix. So now we need to say, well, is that WARD in the word homeward and eastward, is that the same one as in the word toward? I don't pronounce it the same, but and it's spelled the same, but sometimes things have the same spelling, but they're really not the same thing. We could identify a sequence of letters, but we have to be sure it's actually a morpheme. And how do we do that? Well, etymology is an incredibly helpful resource and tool to help us do that. So here is the beginning of the etymology, or the etymology of the word toward, the word itself. And what this tells us, and by this way, this is from etymonline.com, which is my favorite etymological reference. It's a wonderful resource, well-written, very accessible. It is also nice to use because it's easy for me to explain to you the logic that I was using here and have you be able to go to the same resource and take a look at it yourself. So this comes from Etymonline, and what this tells us is that the Old English word toward was spelled in this way, spelled a little bit differently. Not even sure of the pronunciation, but I know I could tell from this that this is the written form. And it meant in the direction of, and it was a prepositional use of the same word as an adjective. So this was first an adjective. And I went back and looked at the OED to kind of understand this. And people might have talked, I think it was in the 1600s, about the toward winter, the toward storm, the coming, approaching winter. So it was used as an adjective. We don't do that, at least I'm not aware of that use today in English. It has changed to more of a prepositional use. So that's kind of interesting to see. But then the other thing to know is that it was formed in Old English from this base, TO, and then from the etymon of this suffix, WARD. And in Etymologine, one of the things to know is that this is written with an eye to efficiency. So not think of all those words that have a WARD suffix in it, right? If those words all in the etymology explained the history of the suffix, they would all be very long. Instead, they all point towards this suffix where you will find more information. So first, let's go to a little bit more information on this base, TO. What it tells us here in Etymologine is that this was an Old English word spelled in the same way that meant in the direction of, for the purpose of, furthermore. And there's lots more information here, right? It tells us it's from West Germanic, but notice this little asterisk. A lot of people will say, go to Etymologine and you can get a lot of good information. And that's true, but it's really important to understand how to read it. And when you come to something that has an asterisk, what that means is it's a reconstructed or hypothesized word. We don't have written evidence for that. And there will also be lots of really interesting and useful information that we might want to take a look at. This entry, in fact, has several more paragraphs, but for our purposes today, this is really all we need to focus on, the actual etymology that it told us that we know from the written form, that it came from Old English to, spelled TO, that meant in the direction of, for the purpose of, furthermore. Now, what's interesting too is to look at the fact that this means in the direction of, this meant in the direction of in Old English and does today, and this had the same sense of in the direction of. So we have to ask ourselves, why would we need both? We'll talk about that in just a second. So we had this word formed in Old English from this base and then this suffix. And now here again is a lot of information. And again, I'm going to just get rid of the stuff that we don't need so much. What we want to look at is the actual etymology, that this was an adverbial suffix expressing direction. And the spelling in Old English was like this. And it meant toward, literally turn toward, sometimes this, and the original notion was of that idea of being turned toward. So we have a base that meant in the direction of, combined with a suffix that meant turn toward, which ended up with a preposition that meant in the direction of. So why did we need both? Well, this is one of those really interesting things to think about as we look at morphology, as it helps us understand words and as we understand how etymology can inform that. So the sense and meaning of words changes over time. The connotation of words and the way we use them changes over time. But there's often this deep sense carried in the word or in the base that is there to some extent. So we have the word to, that means in the direction of, has this deep sense of in the direction of. The word toward also has this deep sense in the direction of. But think about how we use those two words differently today in English. If I were to say, I'm going to give you directions to get to the cabin, and I'd like you to head to the lake first. The first step is head to the lake, then, or the first step is head toward the lake, then, right? Heading toward the lake does not necessarily imply that you'll get there. You're in the direction, but you may not arrive. Where if you're saying you're going to the lake, we have this sense that that means you're going all the way to the lake. So even though these have this deep sense of in the direction of, we use them in different ways. There are wonderful subtleties that we can uncover by looking at the way these words are put together and their history. So it's important to recognize that when we look at morphology, when we look at bases and suffixes and prefixes, we shouldn't expect that we can take the deep sense of a base or the meaning of a base, the grammatical use of that suffix, the grammatical use of the prefix, maybe some sort of meaning sense that it attaches, and just add them up to get the word. It doesn't always work that way. And I'll show you another example of that a little later on. So morphology helps us. It informs our understanding of the word's usage today. It gives us a way to anchor that, but it's not just a matter of adding them up and then saying them, which sometimes works, but sometimes doesn't. So the other thing is, as we're asking ourselves, is the suffix W-A-R, is there really a suffix W-A-R-D in this word T-O-W-A-R-D? And is it the same as in, say, the word eastward? Is we can look at this etymology and see that, oh, this was eastward, also eastwards. And you may know some people will say towards instead of toward. That's an alternative form of that word. But we can see the same spelling here with an E in this case, without the E here. I'm not sure why, but I don't even have to understand that fully to say, okay, this is the same suffix because it's showing us the etymology of this following in the same direction. So in Old English, this suffix and this suffix, we could assume are variant spellings of the same suffix. And again, now so we can identify that eastward has that suffix, the same suffix that we have in toward. And then here are other words that use that same suffix. So again, I want to point you to how often this suffix is being reused: inward, outward, upward, downward. Interesting to notice these prepositions that have this suffix attached, as well as these base elements. And here we have a preposition with the suffix attached. So we see a pattern there that isn't unusual for the overall system of English. It's interesting to note too that words like awkward have that same suffix. There actually at one time was a free base awk that meant kind of, I think, in the wrong direction. I may have that a little bit wrong. You can look that up in Etym online, but I believe it was in the wrong direction. So if you were awkward, you were kind of moving in the wrong direction. Now we have a different sense of that. Someone's going wayward. And even afterward, which now we're not talking direction, we're talking time, but it gives us this idea of it's in the direction of after, that's when we're going to be doing something. The other thing, especially as I talk about not just adding up elements to get a meaning, is we have the word toward, but then we have the word untoward, right? And I would pronounce that untoward. I wouldn't say untoward, I don't think. So that pronunciation can shift even in our own articulation of these words. But if we know the word toward, and we think of that prefix un, which we know often means not, or the opposite, or undoing something, untoward doesn't mean not going toward something, right? There's something else going on. We use that today to mean it's something unexpected, inappropriate, inconvenient, something untoward happened, or someone made a very untoward joke. So for kids, if we are priming them to say, you just put that on and it means the opposite, they're going to be confused by this word. And we're going to be confused too. So the other thing to do is try to remember and help our kids understand that prefixes and suffixes can do many different things. That's one reason they're called prefixes and suffixes rather than base elements that have a much more kind of solid, enduring sense in many words. So how did we get to this usage of the word untoward? Well, if we look at the history, it was indeed formed from this stem that formed the same word toward, and then un. But it meant in the 1520s, not having an inclination, difficult to manage, unruly. So you can kind of see that, right? It was toward is moving in the direction you want someone to go. If they're untoward, maybe not going where you want them to go, not having an inclination, and then becoming really inappropriate or inconvenient or unexpected. So these usages do evolve over time, and we need to think about this. These deeper senses can help us understand these words more clearly and effectively. So the deep sense is, I've got you guys all sitting right over my note there. Well, the deep sense is always present. The connotation evolves is what I want to get you to think about. Okay, let me see if I can move this thing that you don't see, but is right in my way. Okay, so what about the pronunciation though? So we're back to this word toward. So you might say, okay, fine, T-O plus W-A-R-D. I can understand that, but we're not saying that we want you to teach T-O as a unit, as a whole unit, and W-A-R-D as a whole unit. That's no better than saying we're going to just teach the whole word and just memorize it. We want to use those phonemes and graphemes and their relationships to be able to really understand these words and unlock more words. And actually, because I don't want to forget to say this, I want to stop and just make a point. We are going into a great deal of detail about one word. And the reason is not that I would encourage you to think, okay, so for any word that I encounter, I have to spend an hour thinking about that word. That's not the point at all. The point is that every unexpected spelling has the potential to reveal things about the system. And as we learn those things about the system, the next word we encounter is not going to be quite so confusing. And that word might have something new that we learn from it. And then the next word we encounter, we have more to work with. So this is about understanding the system, because these ideas I'm talking about in this one word are going to show up everywhere in the English writing system. So how can we make sense of the pronunciation of this word, toward, however you might say it? Well, let's think about the pronunciation of inward, outward, and southward. Would we call that spelling W-A-R-D irregular or tricky? Well, let's see if it's consistent, right? We see it already in the same three words. And I'm showing you a representation in IPA, but this is how it's represented in the New Oxford American Dictionary. There are other ways to represent that pronunciation of the vowel, the AR, that are probably more precise. But one of the things that's nice to see here is they're emphasizing that it's a schwad pronunciation, it's a neutral pronunciation. And you can also see something about the stress in the word. So inward, outward, and southward are all stressed at the beginning. That first syllable is stressed. Inward, outward, southward. So this part then becomes unstressed and more neutral in its articulation. Okay, you're probably familiar with that if you've done literacy work where you're working with the schwa. So phoneme grapheme relationships and the way that those show up in pronunciation are affected by stress. So when we have an unstressed AR following a W, this is what we would expect for the pronunciation. Sort of an erd, but not stressed. Inward, outward, steward, stalwart. I don't even say that long word, that last word very often. I can read it and understand what it means, but I never use it in spoken language. So an unstressed AR following a W will be pronounced just as we see in inward and outward. Stressed, however, a W, an AR following a W is pronounced more like in war or ward or warn or thwart. It's that or. And we know that W affects the pronunciation of the vowels that follow. The pronunciation of W affects the pronunciation of the vowels that follow. So we're seeing that here, ward. So, okay, fine. So if we go back to toward then, what are we noticing about toward? So inward, outward, southward, the stress is initial. It's in the very beginning of that word. And the WARD is unstressed. In toward, either toward or toward, and this is how the two representations that are present here, or even toward, where you don't pronounce the w. The stress is on that AR in the written word. So when we say toward, we're stressing the second part. If we say toward, the stress is on the whole thing, because in a single syllable word, the stress is on the entire word. So this is a stressed AR following a W, which means that we pronounce it as we do in thwart, toward, award, right? So suddenly I can make sense of this. And I will tell you that I always knew, I knew for a long time that we could look at the morphology of toward as TO plus WARD, but I never actually took the time to think, why do we pronounce that AR that way? Is it really just one of those pronunciations that's just changed over time and we can't, I can't necessarily explain it. There may be people who could, but I can't always explain those. In fact, it's very consistent with the patterns of the language. A W with an AR that follows, that stress, that AR is often going to be pronounced like war, or. So we're seeing consistency in the pronunciation as well once we go this deep. Now, again, we don't have to go this deep. If you're teaching a child to spell Toward, it can even be as simple as it's a TO plus a WARD, and the WARD shows up in other places. And they can understand that without all of this in-depth analysis, but it's super helpful to be able to share it with students who need it. Now, you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, what about word? So we have inward, outward, and word. So a W, again, preceding an OR, the phonology of that is going to affect the articulation of that OR, and we pronounce this stressed OR as word. Here it's unstressed, but it's really close. But this is where the written form is so clarifying, right? We know there's a difference between inward and word because the spelling is different. And we see this in the words forward and forward. For me, those are homophones. They sound exactly the same, but we know instantly when I read forward and forward, and if you were just listening, you'd be thinking, which one is she talking about first? If I just say, let's talk about the word forward first, you don't know which one I mean. If I spell it, FOREWORD, now you know which one I'm talking about. So the spelling is actually helping us identify the word. It is giving us that identity so that we can know what the word is as we're reading, and enhancing comprehension for students and adults as they read. So if you're more interested in these two words, I did write about this a couple of years ago. I haven't even read through it again recently, but I probably would say some things differently. But if you go to my website and scroll down, there's a number of posts, and one of them is specifically on these two words, FOREWORD, and then FORWARD, and explaining things about the differences there. So we talked about that TO, the base, being present in other words. And we talked about this WARD being present in other words. We talked about this pronunciation. What about this one? Why do we pronounce this the way it is? Or why do we spell it the way it is? We pronounce it the way it is because that's the way the word is pronounced, but why do we spell it that way? And the reason we ask that question, and the reason this is often taught as an irregular word, is because we're not saying toe, we're not pronouncing the O as an O, we're pronouncing it as an oo. But there are many different ways that we can spell oo in English. This one-to-many characteristic of English is one of the things that makes it challenging to learn. But what we want to do is understand why. Why are we using, say, an O in the spelling of TO, rather than these other options? And we know that O spells oo in a couple of specific situations. One of them is in these words, due to this TWO, to, who, and then the compounds that are compounding with this TO spelling. And the reason we use O has to do with conventions relating to function words. These are function words, or this is it's a functional sort of word. So English, you may know, can be divided, words in English can be roughly divided into two categories: content words, which are kind of the meaty words that carry most of the meaning in sentences. And those are the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, and the adverbs. And then we have these function words. And function words are often referred to as the little words, right? We talk about those. And there's a good reason for that, right? Notice how many of these are short little words. Not every function word is short, but they can be short. Because one of the conventions of English is that content words are spelled with at least 3 letters. And many of you may know this, but I say this every chance I get, because I don't know why I didn't learn this when I was in first grade, because it immediately allows us to understand these spellings of odd and egg and ebb and aw and die and other words as well. But there are a number of very short words spelled with 3 letters where we do not need the final letter for the pronunciation, right? Think about egg and leg. L-E-G doesn't need that second G. It's not doubled consistently through the system. It's doubled here because that makes that word egg 3 letters long. And we think that in the history of the development of English, that was something that scribes did long ago to kind of add emphasis to those important words in sentences. So it's almost like a visual stress that was added to writing. So Content words are at least 3 letters. However, function words can be as few letters as are needed to represent the phonology and clarify the identity of the word, to tell us what that word is, but they can be short. And we see lots of short words. The 2 words in English, the I and the that are 1-letter words, are both function words. So once we know that, we can then go back and look at this spelling and say, oh, that is a logical spelling for those function words, because it's the shortest, it's the fewest letters. It gives us the fewest letters in that spelling of that word that's going to be used all the time and show up all over the place. And you might notice, well, this is also a 1-letter grapheme that can represent oo in words like rumor or blue. But if you're familiar with the convention that typically words in English don't end in u, they're typically followed by an e, then it makes sense that this one would definitely be preferable. The other thing is, you can say to yourself, well, a function word could end in a u, because in fact, we have a function word here that ends in a u, but this has its own story. And one of the ways to help kids understand this spelling is we're actually spelling the oo with an OU, which is present in you, and it's related to the word thou. So in thou, an old-fashioned word, we pronounce that OU as we would expect, does end in a U. In you, related, we pronounce it differently. We do as we do in like soup, has this kind of maybe French influence, but it's got its own story. So we can connect those 2 words together. So as we learn more about how the system works, these relationships between words that aren't pronounced the same, but have a similar etymology, a similar story, maybe a similar function in the language, those can help us understand those spellings. So we can make sense of TO by understanding what function words do and seeing how that pattern works. I'm going to give you a little bit more information on this because this is such a great topic to talk about and has so many different impacts. So we can see that same thing present in do, and notice that the content versions of words that are pronounced do have longer spellings. And I have just thought, I'm just going to see if there are any other D-double-O words that I could come up with, and I found doodad, doo-wop, and doodle, and notice these all use that double O that we would expect, right? Fun words that show us that this is probably the more expected pronunciation of oo, but we have a reason for this one now. Same thing is going on here. This is probably the more expected pronunciation or spelling. I apologize if I say pronunciation instead of spelling sometimes. I get going too fast and the words come out the wrong side. So here we have the spelling that we would expect, this double O grapheme, but here we have a reason. This is a function word, this is an adverb, a content word. And here we have a word with a function word spelling of the vowel, the O, but it has been lengthened, or it kept its longer spelling with this WO from its history. It's not really a content word or a function word, it's a cardinal number, which has its own sort of category. But many of you may know that this W, we can interpret that as being there as an etymological remnant, comes from its history. And it shows us a relationship between 2 words that came from the same etymon and have the same sense of two-ness, and where the W is pronounced. So twin, twice, 20, which is 2 tens, 12, which is 10 plus 2. We've got that W in there showing us that connection to the idea of 2. And we have who here. And this pattern repeats in the system where we have often homophones in and in, where the longer spelling will be the content word, the shorter spelling will be the function word. And we can begin to understand the reasons for these. So one of the things to notice here is, of course, there is a representation of pronunciation in these words, right? We don't spell this 2 with a Q at the beginning and an H at the end. It's got the T, and it's got a representation of oo that is present in different places in English. But the fact that we have all these different ways to spell phonemes, the different ways to pronounce graphemes, allows other things to happen in writing that show us more than just pronunciation. They help us understand the identity of those words. So that is also really important in the word does. And many of you may have seen this, but I always have to show this if I can. So Ronit mentioned that my son is dyslexic, our oldest son. He's 29 now, doing great. Still can't spell because I didn't learn this early enough. And now he doesn't want to know. But when he was young, he learned to read, but he never could spell this word does. Sometimes it was D-O-S-E, sometimes it was D-O-S, sometimes it was D-U-Z. He was just winging it. He did not understand that spelling. It was random letters to him that he couldn't make sense of. Once you look at the structure, it's so much easier, right? I do, he does, I am doing, she is doing. We put D-O together with a suffix ES. We understand why there's an O in do when we talk about function words. We understand why we use the suffix ES when we know that form of we have an S and an ES. We use an ES in certain situations. One is when a base ends in an O, like in echoes. So now we can understand why an ES. We have that same functionality of the suffix ES. I echo, she echoes, I cry, he cries. We see that ES doing the same job. And it's pronounced differently depending on what's going on with the phonology of what comes before it, but it's spelled the same. And that's what kids need to learn, is the spelling. So we can anchor that all in that phonology, but we can have them understand that the spelling is understandable. One more example of how this idea can be really helpful. This is from, this is a curriculum that a school that I worked with used. And these were the words that kids were asked to learn to read by sight, to learn quickly, some of them decodable, some of them not considered to be decodable, but they were supposed to learn to read these and recognize them in kindergarten. And notice that we have these words, we, me, he, and she, and then we have C3 and green. So if I'm a kindergartner, I might be able to read all these words, but when I go to spell them, how do I know which spelling to use? And this comes up again in the same curriculum in first grade, where there's a spelling unit that's focusing on a long E spellings, the double E and the single E. And these are all mixed up. And there really isn't an explanation in here of why. I'm sure because the curriculum developers just didn't know this. It's not common knowledge yet. Hopefully it will be soon. But if we only consider pronunciation, how does a student know which one to use? But we can separate these into function words and content words, have kids begin to understand that, and suddenly they can understand this one is a very kind of common verb, takes that functiony spelling, and then we've got 4 pronouns. And then these are words we could probably draw pictures of, right? Can't always draw pictures of these. So we could have kids think about content and function words from a very early age. And one of my favorite ways to do that with kids, because you might think, well, how do I do that with a kindergartner or even a preschooler, is you play with sentences. My cat sneaked quietly into the food bin. So I can show them that sentence with just the content words and say, would you understand what I meant if I said cat sneaked quietly food bin? Probably have a pretty good idea. If I say my into the, how's that going to work, right? You have no idea what that sentence is about. Now, without this preposition and without the article, there's missing information for sure. We don't know it's my cat. We don't know they went into the food bin. Maybe they sneaked around the food bin. So there's information there for sure, but the content, the meat of the content is carried in those content words. So we can play with that from an early age and get kids and our colleagues thinking about these different categories and how powerful they are. So I'm going to wrap up. I think my timing's pretty good, and talk about these 3 spelling concepts then that I've been illustrating through these examples. The first one is that morphology is the framework and the foundation of the spelling system. Doesn't mean that phoneme grapheme relationships aren't essential. We teach them from day one, but words are actually composed of morphological units. We build words by putting together morphological elements, like we did in the word toward, T-O plus a suffix W-A-R-D. those combine consistently. And we didn't really talk about the suffixing conventions today, but those three conventions are extremely consistent and allow us to synthesize words with confidence once we have the morphological elements. Morphological elements are spelled consistently. However, their pronunciation will often shift. This is what we don't expect often, and this is what we should expect. We saw it in do and does. We saw it in inward and toward. We will see over and over and over again that the spelling of an element is almost always consistent. And if it changes, there's a reason that it changes. It can have different forms. But in synthesizing words that use that spelling, the spelling doesn't change just because once we add a suffix, we suddenly pronounce it differently. Spelling is much more consistent. Once we look at structure, then we can ask why the particular graphemes are in the spelling TOWARD, and we can understand it, as we hopefully got a chance to do today. So the second concept then is that spelling reveals the identity of words. This is the ultimate purpose of spelling. It's not just providing signals of pronunciation. And it does that using many different ways. Obviously, we have graphemes that signal phonemes. So if we look at words like these, we can get the identity of the word just by connecting that spelling to its pronunciation, and we've got it. But there are many situations where that's not enough, and there's more going on in words. So we want to show kids this from the very beginning, because it's really important to recognize that the foundation of the system is these morphological structures, and they reveal elements. For example, in these two spellings, ODE and OWED, if I said them, ode and ode, you do not know which one I'm talking about. Let's talk about ode. Look at that one. You don't know which one to look at, but the spelling shows us that this is a base and this is a base plus a suffix. And once we understand these suffixing conventions and kind of look underneath the surface structure of that word to see the underlying structures, then we can understand what that element is. Oh, this is the past tense of the verb owe. I owed someone an answer. Same thing we see in days and days, facts and facts, right? I'm saying them. If you're just listening and not looking at the screen, you won't know what I'm talking about, right? There is more information in the written form, and we want to show this to kids from day one. There are also signals of phonology in spelling, obviously, not only the phonemes or the graphemes that are signaling phonemes, but other letters that may be showing signals of phonology. This is showing us that we have a long A here. However, this one isn't. It's talking about this being a J pronunciation instead of a G. Or ng. And we have many other things that a final E can signal in words. We haven't even touched on most of them. But the other thing to recognize is that spelling signals other things. If I see ME and SEE, I've now gotten a signal, oh, that's a content word, that's a function word. And it helps us identify what those words are. Often the written form is more clarifying than the spoken form. So that brings us to our last concept, which is that written and spoken language are interrelated. Of course, we have close connections between them, but they are distinct systems that have their own patterns. There are ways that spoken language, when we use spoken language, we have all kinds of tools as we talk. I'm waving my arms everywhere, constantly and making little gestures, and I'm watching your faces and I'm trying to see, does that make sense? Or, oh, that made sense. Good. I'm glad that seemed to click. So I can work with other things with spoken language. With written language, we just have the written form, and it is its own system that will communicate the meaning of a word or the identity of a word just all by itself. So we want to study spelling in order to understand spelling. So grapheme phoneme relationships then are going to make sense once we understand these structures, the relationships between words, conventions, and lots of other things. And Ronit is very enthusiastic about my book, which I really appreciate. And I wrote that book to try to explain a lot of these ideas. So it's not just a simple direct translation. So very final note, you might ask, what do I do next? your knowledge is what's important. And it's not, my book isn't the only way to learn about this. I want to be clear. There's all kinds of ways that you can learn more. I do have a lot of things listed on my website of further resources where you can learn more, classes and books and websites and places you can go. I hope this is a useful book to many of you. And then my friend and colleague Gail Venable wrote a wonderful companion to it. She didn't write it as a companion, but it works well together where she's looking
I
up.
think Gail might be in the room with
Oh,
us.
might be. Yeah. And this is a fabulous book. So both of these are resources for you. I do want to thank you for being here. And now we're ready for questions.
Wow, Sue, it is so exciting to always listen to you. I sincerely hope, if you have not already purchased a copy, I believe that all K through 12 teachers should read this book. It is, as a few people put in the chat, it is mind-blowing, and my students love to know this stuff. Oh, I see some people showing their copies. So again, I didn't need to know all this stuff to learn to read, but I have a daughter. This dramatically helps her. My students love it, whether they are at whatever level. It's powerful. And I'm so thrilled, Sue, that you were able to join us today. And now I will monitor the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can ask her any questions you have directly. Again, thank you so much, Sue, for sharing this important knowledge with us today.
Thanks, Ronit, for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to scroll through the chat. And so, but if anyone wants to raise their hand.
I'll try to keep an eye out if you put your hand up, and you'll be able to interact. So it looks like Robin, she has her thumbs up. Robin, do you want to say anything to or ask Sue a question?
My friend Robin?
Let's see, I might have to unmute her. Let's see. Or she can unmute herself.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't, I'm camping, so forgive how I look. And my big question, and I know you can't do this in a short, is for those of us who are OG trained with a little or a lot, how do we start to bring this in to our instruction? How do we, when we've got that kid in front of us,
right?
Where do we start?
So the place to start, I think, is usually with something that doesn't seem to work or make sense, right? So a lot of the words that are defined as irregular, toward, does, that is a great place to bring those in. In the book, I have a chapter 5 that talks about the bases do, do, say, say, be, be, and go, go, and those are great places to kind of start showing kids how it works. Because what you can do is, if you're using a curriculum or something that's going to take you through a series and you really need to stick with that, or you want to stick with that, you can just begin introducing this idea that we put words together with morphemes and we build them. So that maybe they can read and spell the word cat, maybe they can read and spell the word dog, and you can point out that we add an S to say more than one. And notice that in the pronunciation of cats, the S is pronounced differently than in dogs. That's going to get them ready for preside and reside, where that S at the beginning of a base is pronounced S in some words and Z in others. We want them to anticipate that flexibility and see that as not something that's a problem or an irregularity, but something that we should anticipate all over the place. So you can start with what you're already doing and show them morphology, show them how building blocks work. You can start with things where you don't need to use the suffixing conventions. If you want to introduce those systematically later, you can do it in spoken language, but you want them to see that we build words by putting them together, putting units together that are going to be consistently used throughout the system. And I see a note there that I must have mixed up when I said phoneme and grapheme. So I did that earlier than I even realized, where I said, but you guys got the idea.
Yes, let's see. And so we have another hand up, C. Mirabal. Let's see. You can go ahead and unmute. Let's see, I might have to help her. Let me see where she went. Let's see.
Hi, yes. My question is also, I'm also Orden Gillingham trained. And when it comes to the schwa sound, I know Orden Gillingham is very much against Barbara Wilson's approach of just teaching them schwa wagging knowing that the schwa sound is so more complex than that. Any good strategies for students that are still struggling on spelling words that have that schwa sound, like we mentioned before, with toward and forward and whatnot?
So one of the things we didn't get into today very much is the power of a morphological family. So when you have a base, you are going to create lots of different words with that base. And often when you add or remove suffixes or prefixes, the pronunciation and the stress will shift. So one of the great examples is the word definite. So definite, if kids were just to learn that by itself, they could maybe get the DE, but then finite, they're both schwad, and how do you know how to spell that? Well, you can connect it to the word define. So definite, when something is definite, it has that same base, and that's the same base that we find in the word define. In define, you can kind of feel that I in the second syllable. And in definite, you don't hear the stress on the suffix ite, but in definition, now you get a stress. So you can work with morphological families and teach a collection of words together. This helps them understand spelling, because that schwa is going to move around and you can anchor it to things that they can understand. They're going to learn a lot of vocabulary, and they're going to learn, most importantly, how the system works, that we put these consistently spelled elements together. The pronunciation may shift. Stress is super important in terms of understanding how words are spelled. You have to be able to identify where stress is and understand what's going on with that. So that would be my number one suggestion about how to work with the schwa, is look for other words where there is stress in the schwad area of that word that you're trying to teach, and expand how you teach that word.
Okay, thank you. Again, there's certainly so much more to learn. I do see a hand up. So Judith, I'm going to go ahead and see if you can unmute.
And I am going to apologize here. I was trying to give definitions, and I got some of the most important ones backwards, but hopefully you look at the slides and ignore what I said.
Okay, Judith, go ahead.
Hi, I've been taking little courses all over, one at the Dyslexia Training Institute, one with Pete Bowers, and I'm dabbling in it. I am a certified academic language therapist, and please forgive me for mentioning this all the time in groups, but I'm ready to drop syllable types and division patterns. And in the past, when I was trying to make sense of it, I would put a column on one side, okay, divide it for pronunciation. And then on another column, I would say, okay, divide it morphologically. I think I was confusing the students more than anything, and feel badly about it, because I think I was trying to make sense of it within myself. And could you comment on that, if that's even appropriate to do?
So I think different people have different ways that they approach this. There are people who say, I absolutely do not do syllable division. There are people who say, I do use syllable division, and I do kind of what you're describing, syllable division and morphological analysis. The thing to remember is where we ultimately want to get kids to. We ultimately want to get them to the point where they can read and comprehend words on the page silently. So one of the ways that I think syllable division can be helpful at certain stages is for kids to be able to see, oh, that's a word I recognize. I know that word. It's in my spoken vocabulary. But as you, I'm sure, are aware, the problem is it can obscure the morphology. So then they're less able to see that. So my take on it is to really focus on the morphology and kind of think about the idea. Sometimes people talk about flexing vowels and giving kids tools to help them try to get close to a pronunciation that they recognize. But for the most part, what we really want to do is show kids, my focus is let's show kids how the system works. Let's show them how these morphemes build words. We can show them that syllable division can be a useful tool if you already know the meaning of the word. But especially with something like, I'm trying to think of good examples. There are lots, but there are places where it will just completely prevent you. I mean, action is the one that Pete Bowers often uses, where it's going to kind of break up right in the middle, or question, right? I never saw the quest in question until I learned this. And I think there's just so much power there. We can talk about pronunciation and say when you have a T followed by an ION, it's often pronounced sh or ch, maybe in question, depending on your pronunciation. But I guess it's more helpful for me to focus on the meaningful units than talk about the pronunciation of the word and let kids kind of extract those regularities, but really do put your attention in helping them understand how morphemes build words. And that gives you meaning.
Thank you for adding some clarification, because I think I have this fear of dropping something and I have to work within a school.
Yeah, and watch to see, is it helping? Because sometimes it may be very helpful, and
Okay.
other times it may not be helpful. And that's when you want to direct kids to what you really want them to focus on in the end, which is the morphology. So the more comfortable you get with it, the more you can see, where it helps and where it maybe actually hinders comprehension, and you want to kind of steer away from that in those cases.
And I feel like, I'll have these morpheme cards where it's TISI and they say sh or DU saying Jew, where it should be where T is in front of I, right?
Yeah.
And so that adds confusion to these kids, because
Yeah, I think the TI is very, very much not helpful. It's just saying T followed by I, and you can do that. You do a little T and then, when followed by I or U.
yeah.
It's going to be more universally applicable anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it looks like Victoria, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, I'm a homeschooler, and I was just wondering, is the second book that you recommended, is that a curriculum? And if not, is there a curriculum that you recommend for homeschoolers?
Neither book is a curriculum. Gail's book, I could even let Gail talk about it, but Gail's book is a collection of essays on particular words and showing how the spelling makes sense, and showing how the understanding the spelling reveals concepts about the writing system. And it's a fabulous book. It would be, as a homeschooler, you might find essays in there where you want to sit down and look at that with your children. There really isn't a curriculum, but there are more and more resources out there that you can use. I should mention, just recently published in the last couple of weeks is something called the High Frequency Word Project that two of my colleagues put together, where they put together a collection of high frequency words and studying those. I don't have that yet on my website. I need to get that up there, but I'll put up that link up today. And other than that, there really isn't a curriculum, but there are lots of resources that you can use as you go along to learn more.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. Well, Sue, this has been a wonderful morning. I will just want to share that I have aha moments all the time now when I read and reread, and then and when I can share these personal experiences with my students, then they make connections, and we just really enjoy these conversations. So thank you so much for helping add to the richness of our understanding of the richness of the English language, and not that other stuff like, oh, it's just crazy. Like,
Let me add just a couple things. I'm just scanning.
Please do.
So Gail's book is called Back Pocket Words, Sharing the Essence of English Spelling. Pete Bowers has written a book that has like 10 introductory lessons in structured word inquiry, kind of an exploratory way of understanding these concepts. Both of those are listed on my website, learningaboutspelling.com. And I don't know off the top of my head the link for the high frequency word website, but I will add that to my website today.
And I did put a link to your learningaboutspelling.com, in the chat. And if we don't have any other questions, I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Let's see. Stop recording.